Okay, so 6:35 has come and gone. I think we'll start there, and we'll admit people along if they come in a little bit late, just as we're going. So I want to begin by thanking everyone for joining us this evening for a little chat on this Intro to Trail Running webinar. My name is David Bowman. I'm a physiotherapist with Move Physiotherapy, and I'm going to be leading the talk tonight. One thing I will mention is that we are recording the talk. So this is so that we can upload it to our YouTube channel after the fact for people who want to review any of the content or folks who couldn't make it, but just giving you guys a heads up about that. So I wanted to start with a little outline of what we're going to be doing tonight. So we'll begin with me sharing a little bit of my background in running and physiotherapy, and then talking a bit about what trail running is for people who are a bit more unfamiliar with it and why it might be beneficial to choose to get into it as part of your activity practice. We'll also do a quick overview of some trail running safety, footwear, and gear tips, and then dive a little bit into a brief overview of some technique for different trail running terrains, as well as cross-training considerations. So things like strength and mobility training that can be helpful for trail runners. We'll also talk a little bit near the end about some local beginner-friendly trail running groups. And then if this presentation does its job and you're super excited to get out for trail running even this weekend, I'm going to talk about 3 different trail running options, as well as give you a GPS file for something that you could try out if you want to take your new skills to the test. And then, of course, we'll make sure that we have a lot of time at the end for any questions that you guys might have or other information that we want to go over. So, as I mentioned, my name's David. I did my physiotherapy training at Dalhousie University from 2019 to 2022. And I also did a master's thesis at that time focused on motor skill acquisition and motor learning. My clinical practice involves a special interest in the treatment and prevention of running-related injuries, and specifically those in trail and long-distance athletes. And my approach to practice is really focused a lot on education, exercise, hands-on therapies, and patient empowerment. So really focusing on giving people the skills and tools that they need to overcome barriers to their activities or sports. With that being said, tonight's talk is purely informational, and so none of the information we talk about is intended to represent health advice. And I would always say that when you are starting out on a new physical activity practice, maybe one that's a bit more unfamiliar to you, it's a great idea to consult with a physician or other healthcare provider just to make sure that that is the right physical activity practice for you, okay? So with that being said, I take off my physiotherapist hat and I put on my trail running hat, and we'll jump into it. So let's start with talking about what trail running is and maybe how it differs from just hiking quickly. So I wanted to begin with going over a couple of trail running myths that are sort of touted around quite a bit. So often what we see is people think that in trail running, our trail needs to be very rugged, rocky, and rooty, like we're running in the Alps, and that your trail run has to be a certain distance in length. So maybe this ultra marathon distance from 50 kilometers to 100 miles or even longer. Another myth is that we think that every second has to be spent running up and down slopes and hills like a mountain goat or a white-tailed deer, and that you have to have lots of costly, specialized shoes and equipment to get into it. And then all of this, again, were these myths true, would lead you to think that trail running is really not something that is beginner friendly and that people would need to have an extensive road running background before getting into it. So again, these are our trail running myths versus our trail running facts. So what I want to share with you guys is that trail running is something that can happen on any kind of surface. So this can be gravel crusher paths, it can be trails in the forest, and sometimes there's even a little bit of road involved. And trail runs don't have to necessarily be super long distances. So they do not need to be these ultra marathon, more than 42K distances. They can be a couple kilometers long or really as long as you want them to be. There's also typically quite a bit of walking mixed in, especially if we're trail running on a tougher or maybe more uphill terrain. I would also add that specific trail running shoes and equipment can be helpful, but for someone who's getting started and thinking about trying to get into it for the first time, you really don't need to invest a ton to kind of get things off the ground. And I would also add that there are a lot of trail running clubs that have beginner-friendly groups or maybe social paces that can kind of help you get going and get more familiar with the sport. So a lot of people tend to be familiar with road running. So if we're differentiating between road and trail running, we typically think about road running as being done through neighborhoods and city streets, and our running stride is usually a more cyclical or repetitive motion. So because of this, it means that it's maybe a bit easier to zone out. We can plug in some music or a podcast. And a nice thing about road running is that we can often do it basically right from our front door. Comparing this to trail running will typically take place in a lot of different environments. So these will be things like maybe forests or mountain paths. And what this means is that we'll often see a very variable running stride compared to road running that depends on the terrain or footing that we're dealing with. So as a result of this, this is going to typically require more presence and awareness of our surroundings. So not only the terrain that we're moving over, but maybe other trail users and even things like wildlife that might be around us. And then unless you are someone who is very fortunate to have trails right outside their back door, typically trail running is going to be something that requires traveling to a trailhead or an access point. So outside of just the running related benefits that we get, there are a number of benefits specific to trail running in and of itself. So one of these is that we often get very diverse muscle engagement compared to road running. And so because of this variable terrain on the uneven surfaces that we're on, we get increased engagement that's been shown in literature of the hip, knee, and ankle stabilizers, which can give us a sort of a more full body or holistic running experience. There's also a number of documented mental health and well-being effects. So it's been found in a 2020 study, and I can't make this up, Smiley et al. Is the name of the author, that regular trail users have increased sleep quality and mood scores compared to non-trail users, and that trail running has been found qualitatively to foster characteristics that include empowerment, bravery, and tenacity in regular trail running users. Trail running is also something that really deepens our connection with the environment. So because of this immersion and connection with nature, this can be something that a lot of trail runners really get out of their sport as compared to, say, maybe road running. And many trail running events and races, including some that I've been to myself, have a way of promoting themes of reconciliation and environmental stewardship through their community setting, which can be very meaningful to people. So with some of our benefits and definitions of trail running discussed, let's go through kind of getting started. So what I want to begin with here are some safety tips. And I think that this is an important consideration for any trail run, regardless of the length or relative difficulty. Even if it's a short run, these trails can often be remote and you can have conditions that change quickly or maybe unexpected events that can occur. So these would be things like inclement weather, injuries, or even wildlife encounters. One of the trail running havens around here is Gatineau Park, and I would implore people, if they are going out to Gatineau Park, to take a look at the NCC website page on black bear safety. There are black bears in the park. It's unlikely that you would encounter one, but again, it's really important to know what to do in the unlikely event that that could happen. I would also say that with respect to safety, there's a lot of considerations for gear to carry with you. So this would be including things like a first aid kit, a charged cell phone that has reliable service, whistle, jacket, and then things like food and water in case you're out for longer than expected and you become hungry or thirsty. And I'll talk briefly in a moment about some of the best solutions for carrying this equipment. And then lastly, whenever you're going out, it's always a good idea to make sure that you're telling someone where you're going, when you expect to return, and as well as what to do and who to contact if there's an incident that should occur. Okay, so with that in mind, let's dive into some of our kind of trail running equipment that you might find helpful. Okay, so footwear and trail running shoes is kind of the biggest differentiator that we have between road and trail running. And I'll go back to this point that not all trail runs require a dedicated trail shoe, but as we get into maybe more challenging or technical terrain, this is going to be something that can be very beneficial for people. So some of our key differences in trail running footwear include the outsole of the shoe. So notably this kind of section here that we see in the photo, this is going to have a grippy rubber compound that'll have deeper treads. And what this is there to do is give you more traction support in maybe wet or uneven terrain. One note about this is that the stickier rubber can wear down quicker if you're using the shoe regularly on the road. So that's just a consideration for kind of having a dedicated pair of trail shoes versus your road shoes. The midsole of the shoe is often typically stiffer and has lower stack compared to a road shoe. And what I mean by stack is basically the height that your foot is from the ground. So a higher stack shoe is almost like running a tiny bit in stilts. And the idea behind having a lower stack is that you're less likely to tilt side to side on uneven terrain in a trail shoe. You might also have in the midsole of the trail shoe a thing like a rock plate or a protective film so that if you step on, say, like a rough surface or a sharp rock underneath, it's not going to penetrate the shoe and hit your foot. And then lastly, the upper of the shoe, typically we'll see a variety of options with trail running shoes. So these can include things like waterproof or Gore-Tex uppers, more breathable uppers, or even abrasion resistant uppers that have like a Kevlar fiber infused into it to help with protecting the shoe if you're in more rough or rocky terrain. Another kind of critical or key piece of gear that we often see for people is a GPS device, so things like a smartwatch. And again, a lot of people tend to have smartwatches, but these would include things like phones or handheld units in addition to smartwatches. I tend to be a bit more partial towards using a watch because it often provides useful running related data like your pace, your distance, and your heart rate. And these GPS devices can also have preloaded routes to help you aid in navigation if you're trying out a new trail or route for the first time. So these would be things like maybe a built-in map, like a topographic map that can help guide you through unfamiliar terrain, or even like a breadcrumb route like we see in the image here that kind of outlines the specific trail that you should be trying to follow. There's nothing wrong with using a smartphone either, but I would say that if you're using a phone, I would consider downloading that route to offline mode so that you can access it in case, say, you were to lose cell service and not lose your way when navigating. We talked a little bit a second ago about solutions for carrying equipment on a trail run. So this is kind of your hydration pack or your vest. And so this is a really good way of thinking about ways to carry supplies like your jacket, your first aid kit, your phone, your food and water for a longer outing. A well-fitting vest should ideally kind of hug the body and form to it and have pretty minimal bounce during your running stride, even when it's fully loaded. A vest that's too large can create friction and have some chafing points, and a vest that's too small can restrict movement and breathing. I will say that hydration vests and packs are not strictly necessary for maybe some of the shorter outings, but again, going back to our conversation about safety, it's an important factor to consider to have necessary safety equipment with you when you're going out into the woods for the first time. If you're someone who's maybe not quite as partial to vests, other options would be things like waist belts or even handheld pockets that have kind of sewn in pockets on the side as another way to carry equipment as well. When we're thinking about clothing and gear and apparel for trail running, I would say that this is probably where we see most of our similarities to road running, where we want to have things that are breathable and lightweight and that we can maybe comfortably layer. Jackets are something that's going to be helpful in more cold or wet conditions, and they're going to help us with conserving body warmth. I will say it's worth considering whether one would need a fully waterproof jacket or not, because again, these are going to be jackets that are great at keeping moisture out, but also very good at keeping moisture in. So as you kind of get sweaty and warm, that moisture is not going to be able to evaporate off of your skin as easily, and you can end up almost getting just as wet as if you were caught out in a rain shower. So just a consideration. One thing that I do want to jump up on a soapbox on quickly for are socks. I am very keen on hyping up socks. I think they're very important, especially in wet or damp conditions. And I tend to be more partial to wool socks. So these are going to be helpful because they help maintain insulation when they're wet. They have antimicrobial properties, and they're going to be better at reducing blistering and chafing as compared to something like a cotton or more acrylic sock. The last piece of gear that I want to talk with you guys about are running poles. So these are kind of a bit of a specific thing to trail running, and they're interesting in that they help us reduce the load on the lower body and transfer it to the upper body. And so they tend to be more beneficial when we are ascending or descending on very steep terrain, as we see in the fellow in the picture here. And one cool thing about poles is that they can also break down into foldable or collapsible segments. So that means that we can take them and we can toss them into our hydration pack for storage. A couple kind of drawbacks to poles are that they are fairly expensive and usually not necessary for beginners. And I would also say that running with poles for the first time takes a lot of practice, and it can be very fatiguing. And anecdotally, I have seen people have their trail run or trail race completely ruined because their upper body was so sore from using poles for the first time, and their legs felt completely fine. So again, just a consideration if that was something you were very keen on adding into your roster, that they do take practice. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some training and technique considerations. So what we're going to do here is talk about some of the challenges in running on different trail running terrain, and then a couple of considerations or thoughts for strength and mobility cross training. In this sort of technique section, I wanted to talk about three different types of terrain today. Okay, so these would be our uphill, our downhill, and our technical terrain. And what we'll do is we'll kind of talk about the general technique and challenges of these terrains, as well as kind of go over David's cues for what I would want someone to keep in mind maybe when they're navigating this terrain for the first time. So let's start with uphills. So it should come as no surprise to anyone that uphill running is probably going to be something that takes more mechanical work as compared to level or downhill running. What I like to have people think about when they're starting out on a climb is that we want to try and increase our step rate, or our cadence, which is our steps per minute, and try to reduce the amount of time that the foot spends moving through the air. So basically keeping the foot as close to the ground as possible to reduce the amount of energy you have to output, while keeping your trunk relatively linear and staying upright. And the analogy here is almost like you're downshifting gears on a bicycle. So you start going up a hill, you shift down, you're able to pedal quicker, but each pedal rotation does a little bit less work at turning the back wheel. When we get into really steep or longer climbs, a lot of runners will switch into what we call a power hike. So this is when we actually open up our stride length. So we take longer steps and then we kind of lean into it with our trunk, and we use our hands to push down the leg to help straighten it out. So this can be a strategy maybe when the hill is feeling particularly long or we can't see the top and running feels like it's too much work for us to keep doing. Uphill running is probably, again, one of those settings where it's going to probably be very helpful to have something like poles to alleviate leg fatigue, but they're, again, not for everyone and not strictly necessary. So here are a few of our kind of uphill running cues that someone going uphill for the first time could keep in mind. We want to think about having really quick steps, so trying to get our feet off the ground as fast as possible and keeping ourselves nice and tall with our weight shifted slightly forward over the balls of the feet, allowing us to push off through the forefoot and the toes. The other thing that I like people to think about, and this translates really well to things like biking and skiing as well, is that you are not trying to run to the top of the hill, you are trying to run over the top of the hill. And so the idea here is that we want to save some of that energy for the nice level or hopefully downhill running that comes after the uphill, and not just kind of flop down like a fish out of water, totally out of breath when we get to the top. And I would always say if it feels like it is too tiring to keep running, slow down to that power hike. Try that out for the first time. And we see even elite level runners in some of the most competitive races on the planet doing this. So I would say if they are using that strategy, it is perfectly valid for us mere mortals to do so as well. When we're thinking about downhill running, this will require less mechanical work as compared to level or uphill running, but we end up having more force absorbed through the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And one really interesting thing is that during downhill running, our muscles need to engage eccentrically. And what we mean by an eccentric contraction, if we use the analogy of saying like a bicep curl, is when you do a bicep curl, the concentric contraction is pulling your arm this way, while the eccentric contraction is controlling the movement as you go back to the start position. So an eccentric contraction is something that produces greater muscle force as compared to a concentric contraction. And so as we're running downhill, this can be something that gets very tiring for people at the end of a longer trail run or race. I would say that with downhill running, we often see that foot placement and our center of mass, so how our body is positioned over where our feet are falling, is going to be an overall greater consideration compared to level or uphill running. So if we're thinking about some of our cues for downhill running, what I would want people to think about are trying to lean slightly forward. And this is going to do two things. It can feel a little scary at first, but it's actually going to, one, reduce the likelihood of a slip and your feet going out from underneath you because your weight is more over where your feet are landing. And it's also going to reduce the impact forces through the heel and the back of the body. So it'll have less stress overall on the posterior chain muscles and tissues. I would also want people to think about gently but firmly bracing through the abdominal muscles. And this is going to help us keep a stable trunk and generate lots of control as we go downhill. We want to, again, focus on that foot placement and where our feet are landing and taking quick, decisive steps. So there's that high cadence cue again to anticipate and navigate some of the upcoming terrain changes, and trying to keep our lower body relatively relaxed. And this is going to help us assist in shock absorption and have less jarring through the joints and bony structures of the lower body. And similar to uphill running, if downhill running feels like it is a bit overwhelming or too tiring at first when you're first trying it out, there's absolutely nothing wrong with slowing down to a walk. Downhill running might be a new skill for a lot of people. It's going to take time to practice, and it's important that you approach it in a way that feels most comfortable for you. Lastly, I want to talk about technical running. So technical terrain, we've talked about this a couple times so far in the presentation, is basically terrain that has lots of small ups and downs. We're going to have obstacles like roots and rocks and maybe some tight twists and turns. So it's almost like you're running on a roller coaster. It's very fun, it's very dynamic, but it can be very tiring. And the reason for this is that we're having to navigate all of these different obstacles and changes. So as the feet are moving through space, it's a lot of extra movement. And if we're not used to it, it can be quite fatiguing. Your objective here is really trying to move as fluidly and efficiently as possible over the different features. And because of this, we have to often anticipate, again, similar to downhill running, all of these upcoming terrain changes and turns and navigate or adjust our stride accordingly. What we typically see with very strong technical runners is that these guys are keeping their bodies very tall. They're going to have a quite high cadence, and they're going to keep their entire body fairly relaxed. So let's go through some of our cues for technical running. So what I would want you to think about are trying to keep your rib cage or trying to draw your rib cage gently towards your pelvis. And you can even try it when you're seated here in your chair at home. And what this is going to do is it subtly engages the trunk muscles. So it's keeping us stable, but still relaxed in a way that's not overly tense. The other cue that we can think about is trying to stand tall while we maintain this core contraction, like a string that's pulling our head up towards the sky. And again, for the third time on our third set of terrains, we want to keep our cadence high. We want to have really fast feet and move our feet through the terrain as quickly as we can. When we're approaching a tight turn, so something like, say, a hairpin or a 90-degree turn in the trail, what I would want you to think about are trying to lean slightly towards the turn through your trunk and your hip rather than using your feet. And the reason for this is it's going to overall be just more energy efficient. And again, if we're thinking technical terrain is quite fatiguing, saving energy wherever we can is going to be in our best interests. The last cue I'd want you to think about, and it's almost similar to driving, is we want to monitor the things that are kind of immediately right in front of us, but also kind of looking 4 to 8 steps down the trail. And what this is going to help us do is prepare for upcoming shifts, maybe make some small adjustments in our stride so that we don't have to quickly move our feet and expend more energy as we do that. Okay. So we have talked a little bit about our technical running technique on these different terrains. Let's talk about cross training. So what I've done for this section is kind of broken it down into 2 broad types of cross training. So these include strength and stability training and mobility and flexibility training. And I wanted to speak globally about the benefits of both of those first before we dive deeper into them. So strength and stability training is a great thing to kind of add into your trail running or activity profile for a number of reasons. It's going to be something that helps us with identifying and addressing different muscle imbalances, and it's going to be a great tool for developing muscle and tendon resilience. And what this means is that we might be less likely to have an overuse injury over time because these tissues are stronger. It's also been demonstrated to improve our fatigue resistance and promote overall running economy or our efficiency when we're running, which can have performance benefits for folks who are interested in that. Our other kind of cross-training division is mobility and flexibility training. And this is something beneficial to include in your training, but I would say that the scientific evidence, so the literature out there on its benefits in trail running tends to be fairly variable and quite limited. There's some research that shows that we get kind of reduced post-run soreness and improved performance indicators in some settings. And what we do know about this kind of training is that it's something that's going to help us improve our muscle elasticity and range of motion through the joints, which again, theoretically could translate to reduced injury risk, but the science on that is still kind of, I would say, a bit inconclusive at this time. So I could probably spend about 4 or 5 hours, and I won't tonight, talking about different approaches to strength and stability exercises. And so what I've decided to do this evening is kind of break them down into 4 different domains and a couple of benefits of those domains, as well as considerations for these exercises. So our first domain is single leg strengthening. And this is helpful because trail running, like road running, is a single leg sport. So if we're stronger in this single leg position, we're going to have overall better stability, power, and force production when we are going through our running stride. So exercises that I'm often thinking about that kind of correspond to this domain would be our Bulgarian or rear foot elevated split squat, single leg Romanian deadlifts, or weighted forward step ups. And all of these are going to have great carryover to your running, whether that's on road or on trail. The second domain I want to talk about is eccentric loading. And so going back to what we said with downhill running, eccentric loading is going to be important because it helps us create more strength in that muscle as the muscle is lengthening out. So this is an important consideration for stability as we're maybe descending quickly or down a hard downhill during our trail run. Movements I like to think about here are our tempo squats. So slowly going down to the bottom of the squat over the course of 4 seconds, pausing for a second at the bottom, going slowly back up over 4 seconds and repeating. controlled forward step downs where we're focusing on keeping good alignment between our hip, knee, and our toe, and single leg calf raises. And we can even do these guys over the edge of a step where we come up and then lengthen the calf out under load as we come back down. So we're kind of getting a strengthening and lengthening effect at the same time. Our third domain are plyometrics. And plyometrics are basically fast, explosive, power-oriented movements. So things like our box jump or our jump squat, these can be very helpful for thinking about supporting our uphill running. So we're trying to create some explosion as we go up the hill, maybe over a shorter distance. One thing I would say about plyometrics is that they can be a little bit intense for people who aren't familiar with them, and there is a slightly higher risk of injury for folks who have not trained them before. So I would always say, in this one in particular, it's important to kind of work on these with someone who might be more familiar with them for the first time. And then lastly, our fourth domain is core stability. So thinking about the core and trunk muscles, these are involved in basically keeping the upper body and really the entire body stable through their contractions. So we want to think about things here like a high plank, and maybe we add in an arm or a leg raise that creates some sort of simulation of our center of mass being adjusted, like in trail running. A farmer's carry, which is going to give us good side-to-side stability as we resist the weight that we're holding in our hands, or a Pallof press, where we're actively resisting rotation from a cable or a band. So all of these are, again, going to be good at training us to kind of keep the body in this centered position. Let's dive a little bit into our mobility and flexibility training. So again, I've kind of got three domains for us to think about in this section. Our first domain is our conventional sort of static stretching. And this would be our long holds for maybe 1 or 2 minutes or even longer that focus on stiff muscle groups. Typically in trail runners, we'll see this being kind of our hamstrings, groin, our calves, hip flexors, quads, all those guys. I would say that static stretching is not something I want people to include prior to running. And the reason for this is it's more preferable to use something called a dynamic warm-up. So our second domain, the dynamic warm-up, is basically a pre-run routine where we are priming our muscles and increasing our core temperature to get ready for the run. So these are things like our lunge, jumping jacks, forward and lateral leg swings, and skipping movements or running drills. I will sometimes add dynamic stretches into the beginning of a trail run warm-up. So this is like a 1 to 2 second pulse in the calves, quads, or hamstring stretch, where rather than stretching the muscle out and holding it, we are dynamically pulling it in and out of its range to kind of get it ready for what we're going to take it through on the run. And lastly, our third domain is foam rolling or lacrosse ball self-release. So kind of these myofascial self-release techniques. And similar to our static stretch, I would say applying the foam roller or the lacrosse ball for 1 to 2 minutes continuously over our stiff or sore area is a good start. I would say to begin with a light to moderate amount of pressure and then kind of increase that over the course of our application. I'll say, and kind of put my science hat on here again, that it's still debated what's actually happening when we do these techniques, whether this is blood flow, neurological input, myofascial release. I would say, honestly, if it works and it feels good for you, go for it and add it into your mobility and flexibility routine. Okay, we are coming into the tail end of our talk here. And like I said, what I want to do here is talk about a few local and beginner-friendly clubs in the area, as well as 3 suggestions for trails that I would recommend to a beginner, a more advanced, or a more intermediate runner. And again, if this talk has done its job and you're super stoked to get out and try the trails, you could even try some of these this weekend. Hopefully there's no snow by then. Okay. So let's go through some of our local trail running clubs and teams. So one that might be more attractive to folks in the Ottawa side of the river are the Bush Taka Trail Runners. So they get together for a Saturday morning social run with multiple distances. This coming Saturday, they have one that's 5 kilometers in length and another that is 9 kilometers in length. And they tend to run more in the Ottawa Greenbelt area. So again, a good option for folks who are maybe not as close to Gatineau. The Chelsea Trail Sisters is based out of Chelsea, and they have a Monday evening social run. And their mission is really kind of, they've created a women's only group, and their focus is on creating a safe, fun, comfortable space for women to get out together and enjoy the trails in a safe, no pressure, comfortable pace environment. Nomad de Parc are also based in Chelsea, and they get out for a Thursday evening social run. They do a couple of different distances. Some are 5 or 10 kilometers in length with some mixed pace groups. I will say that they tend to shut down as we get into the colder months, and they'll be picking things back up again in the spring. But the next group that I'm going to talk about, Natural Fitness Lab, has actually added another Thursday night run to accommodate for this slowdown in Nomad du Parc. So Natural Fitness Lab is probably the more advanced, maybe slightly less beginner-friendly group that I'm going to mention tonight. For some more advanced runners, they do have a Tuesday evening workout and then a Sunday morning endurance run. And these are both done on trails. They have added a Thursday evening run as well recently. And the goal here is to kind of fill that gap that Nomads du Parc had left as we go into the winter months. One thing I will say is we're probably still a few weeks away from the snow, but once the snow does start coming down, many, if not all of these trail running groups are going to start incorporating snowshoe running into their mix. And this could be a whole other talk, maybe a social media post that we'll put out, but snowshoe running is a very fun way to kind of spice up some of your winter activities. So a lot of these groups will switch to that as the weather gets colder as well. Okay, now it's time for the fun part. These are my kind of 3 suggestions for folks who want to kind of try out trail running for the first time or are looking for some other suggestions in the area. So my kind of beginner-friendly trail suggestion is the Sugar Bush Trail in Chelsea. So this is a fairly short trail. It's 1.8 kilometers. It's a little loop. I'm not sure if people can make that out here on the image here below. And it's got about 17 meters of climbing. As I mentioned, it's very beginner-friendly, and I would say it is very minimally technical, meaning that you would not need trail running shoes to go out and do this. You could do this in road running shoes very comfortably. It's very well signed. So in my opinion, it's quite hard to get lost on it, and it's quite close to town. And the other nice thing is that if 1.8K feels like it's too short for you, you can finish the loop and then add on a second loop going back in the opposite direction and maybe pick up on different features or things that you didn't see on the first way around. Another nice thing about this is it is close to downtown Chelsea, so you can duck in there for a croissant or coffee post-run if you want to. As I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, and I think we had some folks who came in a little bit later on, my goal after this talk is to send an email to folks with GPS files of the 3 runs I'm going to talk about. So this will be something you can load onto an app like Strava on your phone or on a smartwatch if you have it, that will guide you along this trail. But I would say it's important before you go out to check with the visitor center regarding trail conditions and do some of your own research just to make sure that the conditions are suitable for running. The next suggestion that I want to talk about is a more intermediate trail. This is the trail number 79B in Gatineau Park, sometimes known by folks as Brazilian. And this is a 6.8 kilometer loop with about 116 meters of vertical climbing, so it gets a little hillier. It's what I would call mildly technical, as we can see in the photo here. It's got some really fun twists and turns, and then it's got a steady downhill on the first part of the loop here. And then we have a steeper uphill that kind of hits partway through. There is also a slight road uphill from the parking area to access the loop. And what I would say is that this loop is good for someone who's maybe more familiar with running and wants to they picked up some trail shoes, they want to get out, they want to practice using them, and they want to even incorporate some of the technical uphill and downhill running cues that we've talked about tonight. As you're going onto trails like this, I would say it's really important to be mindful of other trail users. So these include hikers, other runners, but there are some mountain bikes and gravel bikes that use this trail. So just keep your ears up and around you. And if someone wants to pass, stay on the right so that they can pass safely and comfortably on your left. Lastly, for our really gung-ho folks, I have my advanced trail suggestion. So this is the trail number 15, and it takes you up to the Pink Lake Loop. It runs you about 8.9K, and it's got 273 meters of climbing, so fairly hilly, I would say. And what this is composed with is a pretty steady uphill grind on a fairly non-technical trail from where you'll park your car. So this is just on the side of Rue Marie Berger in Chelsea. And then once you're done that, you kind of do like a lollipop format. So you go out on the trail and then you run the Pink Lake Loop and you go back down when you're done. The Pink Lake Loop is incredibly scenic. It's one of my favorite trails in Gatineau Park, but it has a lot of steep climbs and stairs and some fairly technical footing in the sections along the lakeside. So when you're done with that guy, going back down the number 15 is another great way to practice some of our downhill running cues. And as we mentioned with Brazilian, it would be really important here to be mindful of some of our other trail users. So gravel, mountain bike users, runners, etc. Okay, I've been talking for about 35 minutes and thrown a lot of information at you guys. So what I would like to do is we're kind of wrapped up in the content I have planned for tonight. if anyone's got questions or wants to voice those, we can do this a couple ways. You can drop a question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature, which is just along the taskbar at the bottom, if you want to ask a question over the mic, and that way we're not kind of all talking over each other. But I would say if anyone's got questions, now's the time. And no pressure, but also don't be shy. Drew, go for it.
Hi, it's actually me, Elizabeth.
Oh, hi.
I wanted to ask, so the only trails would be in Gatineau Park, right? There's nothing around kind of downtown closer? Mostly, right?
Sorry, yeah, go on.
No, it's just because I was wondering if there's any other place.
So there's not, there aren't a ton in the Ottawa downtown city core in a significant way. If you go a little further out of town, you have a lot of trails in the Greenbelt area. So things like the Pinney Forest Trail, Jack Pine Trail, and going out even to Canada. The reason I elected not to include those guys here is they actually, even though they are still in Ottawa, they are further from downtown than
I see.
Yeah. So I would say like driving up to Chelsea from downtown might take you about 15 to 20 minutes, whereas getting out to some of those in the more suburban Greenbelt area could take a little bit longer. But if that's an area that folks are interested in, I would be more than happy to throw a couple recommendations in there as well.
No, I was just saying, yeah, but now I see, yes, you're right. Driving to Chelsea is probably shorter than driving to one of the other places.
And I would say just, and this is maybe a bias, but personally, I think the quality of the trails in Gatineau Park is pretty world class. So it's an area that's a great spot to kind of practice some trail running.
And those groups you were mentioning, they usually go to Gatineau Park?
All but one of them. So the Bush Taco Trail Runners runs more in the Ottawa Greenbelt area. I believe the one that they have going on this weekend is going to be on the Ottawa side of the river. So I think they're closer more to the Canada, Stittsville region. But the other three are all in Chelsea or Gatineau Park. Yeah.
Okay, great. That was great talk. Thank you.
No worries. I'm glad you liked it.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess I must have done a really good job because you guys have nothing. It's cool. Oh, nice. Oh, okay. I'll go through Chelsea's here just because she has put it in the chat here. So Chelsea is asking, not sure if it was mentioned earlier or not, but is there any specific gear that you recommend to have for any just in case scenarios? So yeah, they're basically what I always like to have with me, and this can be something that you either carry in a vest or a sash, like a fanny pack or something like that. These would be things like your cell phone, so that being fully charged, a basic first aid kit, and it doesn't need to be anything fancy, but again, this could be things like some bandages, some disinfectant, potentially a bit of gauze, and then depending on the carrying capacity you have, I do like to have another layer, like a jacket, and then some food and some water for hydration, as well as a whistle, just in case I had to make like a loud noise on the trail or something like that. So those would be my pretty base level pieces of gear that I would recommend. But it also depends on the person and the setting you're in. Yep, no worries. Ben, you can go for it.
Awesome. Thanks for the talk.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, question about someone who's new to not just trail running, but also running. If like I'm slowly ramping up running, and I'm curious about trail running as well, but I want to be cautious about avoiding injuries. Do you have any tips for balancing like road running and trail running at the same time?
So I would say that when we're approaching running in general, and this includes, like, for instance, I identify kind of as a trail runner, but some of my training is on roads as well, is the most important consideration is just going to be your general volume. So as you are progressing your volume, we sometimes use the 10% rule. So if you're looking at how much you run in a given week, if you ran 10 kilometers last week, maybe 10% of 10 is 1 kilometer. So maybe you only want to go up to 11 next week rather than doing a big jump to 15 or 20. And this is relevant whether we're thinking about road running or trail running. And trail running in and of itself, outside of maybe higher risk of, say, like, rolling an ankle or stumbling over a route or something like that, doesn't necessarily present with more risk of injury compared to road running. So if we're thinking about things like overuse injuries, like runner's knee, IT band syndrome, etc., but the same risk factors are present in running versus road running versus trail running. So what I would say to someone thinking about that is just be mindful of your volume that you're doing, listen to your body, and gradually increase your volume and your intensity, and just take it at a pace that feels comfortable and sustainable. So I don't think you need to apply any special guidance to thinking, I'm going to add some road or some trail running into the mix as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. Well, I think if that's what everybody's got, we'll leave it there for now, folks. So what I would like to say is thank you so much for choosing to spend some of your Thursday evening with me. It was super fun to put together this talk and nerd out a little bit about some, background on trail running. I would say if you have any other questions or things you want to know about trail running, please feel free to reach out. My email's here. It's david@movephysiotherapy.ca. I'm more than happy to talk about anything related to trail running or those things that we went over in this conversation at any length. One thing I will say as well is if you are someone who's maybe more interested in physiotherapy and you're not sure if you would benefit from working from a physiotherapist, we do offer a 10-minute complimentary consult call at Move. So our website's here, it's movephysiotherapy.ca. And you could jump on, chat with a physio, it's no cost to you. It could be about trail running related things, it could be about anything injury related, but that resource is there to you if you want. So as I mentioned, what we'll try and do is we'll get this webinar uploaded to our YouTube, and that will be a resource that you can kind of reflect back on. I know there's a lot of information on some of the slides. I wanted to make sure that we got it all out there, but for your review, it will be available after the fact. And we do kind of have some workings of a plan to maybe, possibly, fingers crossed, get some more content out over the winter through our social media, and then potentially, we're still working out the logistics on this, but maybe do a 2.0 in the spring once the snow melts for something in person, which would be really cool. So we could practice and put into practice some of the things that we talked about in terms of uphill, downhill, technical running technique, etc. But stay tuned for that. We'll keep you guys posted. So yeah, thank you again for your attention this evening and for coming out. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday night.
Thank you.